Good morning, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you back to the second day of the annual FTC Microeconomics Conference. Normally in this slot, we would have a greeting from someone from the Tobin Center talking about the Tobin Center, because there are wonderful co-sponsors for this event, the Yale Tobin Center for Economic Policy. Unfortunately, this year, no one from there was able to make it to speak. And so Steve Berry, the academic director of the center, just said, say a few words about Tobin. So I will say thank you. We really appreciate their co-sponsorship in this event, really since 2019, and their partnership in putting it on. With that, the only other administrative thing I'm supposed to say is please do not bring food or drink in here aside from water. We had a coffee spill yesterday, and that's not great. So let's just try to keep food and drink aside from water out of the room. With that, it's a pleasure to see you all, and I will turn it over to Daniel Stackman, who we're very happy was able to make it in from Boston, to introduce the first session.
Okay, thank you, Ted. First up will be Felipe Barbieri from Dartmouth Tech School of Business, and his paper will be discussed by Nathan Miller from Georgetown University.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much for having me. This is joint work with my colleague Gregory Doubles, who works for the US Department of Justice, hence the very visible disclaimer that you can see here. So let me start with two numbers. First, in 2011, the number of houses owned by large landlords in the US was 0. Fast forward to today, this number is now 500,000. Now, what happened within barely a decade? Large financial institutions such as private equity-backed companies or real estate investment trusts purchased hundreds of thousands of single-family homes, that is one-unit houses, and started renting them out as landlords. So throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to these institutions as institutional landlords. Now, these purchases did not happen uniformly across the US territory, as these institutions focus their purchase on specific metropolitan areas, and as a consequence, the share of rental houses owned by institutions in several of these metropolitan areas is now at historical heights, and this created concerns that these institutional landlords could be hurting consumers, either because in the rental market they were so big that they could exert market power and raise rents, or because in the homeownership market they were buying so many homes that there are very few homes available to individual consumers like you and me. Now, this generated a lot of media attention, congressional hearings specifically about institutional landlords, and finally some policy proposals, and there's now several bills in the US Congress, as well as several bills, state bills, and then finally a recent executive order showing this is becoming a bipartisan issue that essentially proposed to take Wall Street out of the housing market. Now, despite the attention to the potential negative effects of these institutional landlords, their overall economic impact is unclear. So I just want to first lay the groundwork to carefully study their welfare effects by setting up, what are the key forces at play here. There's two key economic forces at play. The first one involves reallocation of homes between the rental and homeownership sector and vice versa. Right? So when an institutional landlord buys a home that wasn't in the homeownership sector and then rents it out, it first decreases the supply of homes for sale, which puts upward pressure on sales prices, and it increases the supply of homes for rent, which puts downward pressure on rents. That's the first force at play. The second force involves an increase in rental concentration. As these firms enter the rental market, this has two effects. First, it gives more market power to landlords in the rental sector, which puts upward pressure on rents. And the second effect, which we usually associate as a benefit from concentration, right, is that these big firms, they enter the market, marginal cost, average marginal cost tends to decrease. However, here the effect of these decreasing marginal costs could actually reinforce the effect of market power. What is going on? So there's two key marginal costs. there's a daily cost of occupancy. So this is a classic, production marginal cost. You decrease that marginal cost, that, lowers rents in equilibrium. However, there's also a daily cost of vacancy. Right? You decrease that marginal cost. Now landlords have an incentive to keep a property open for longer and to wait for the tenant who's willing to pay a little bit more. Right? So the overall effect of these decrease in marginal costs doesn't necessarily need to be a decrease in rents. It could actually be an increase in rents and reinforce the effect of market power. Right? So this is kind of an overview of the key forces at play here. And what we do in this paper, given these forces, is that we try to answer the following research question: how do institutional landlords affect welfare in the single-family housing industry? And so our strategy to answer this question is going to proceed in 3 steps. So we first are going to gather novel data on prices and ownership of US single-family houses, and we're going to provide some new facts on rental concentration at the very local level down to the zip code level for the first time. So guided by these facts, we're then going to build an equilibrium model of the housing market, and we're going to allow for matching frictions, and we're also going to allow for landlords who own multiple houses to exert market power into coming from not only differentiation but also from multi-product portfolios. We're going to pay special attention to how we identify demand elasticities, and we're going to do something non-standard here. Is we're going to use the granularity and of our data to identify demand elasticities using discontinuities around price changes. So more on that later. And then finally, with our estimated model, we're going to counterfactually measure welfare effects of institutional landlords by running some counterfactual simulations. And you should think about the main counterfactual that we're going to use is what would be the world today if institutional landlords hadn't entered. Okay. Okay, so what do we find? The first thing that we find is somewhat intuitive. As institutional acquisitions decrease the supply of homes for sale, they're going to hurt home buyers. We quantify by how much. They increase sales prices by about 5% and decrease the average home buyer welfare by about $50,000, which is about 10% of the average sales price in this market. Now, the second and main finding of our paper, which is something that ex ante is not necessarily intuitive, is how they affect renters, right? And we find that institutional acquisitions benefit renters overall. Right? And the overall effect of these acquisitions is that they decrease rents by 2%, increase the equilibrium quantity of housing consumed, that is rental transactions, by a whopping 25%, and they increase average rental welfare by about $2,800 per year. Now, this is just the overall effect. What would be interesting here is to decompose this overall effect into the 2 forces that I mentioned before. We can do that, for instance, for the price effect, just as an example. So rents go down by 2% because, on one hand, higher concentration increases rents by 4%. However, the increase in rental supply from these institutional acquisitions, more than offsets the effect and decreases rents by 6%. And that's how you get a decrease in rents overall by 2%. And we also quantify how much institutional acquisitions affect suppliers as well. They benefit house sellers and hurt landlords. House sellers are really happy because they can sell their house for a higher price and faster, and their profits go up by $22,000, and landlords with higher competition decrease their yearly profits by about $600 per house. Okay? We have several contributions to literature. I'm not going to dwell too long on that, but happy to discuss this given the time constraints. Okay, so let's jump into the data and the facts. So before I do that, I just want to pause and say that this is a really important market. A third of Americans are renters. However, there's very little readily available data on granular prices and quantities in this market, especially for single-family homes. So we're going to fill this gap. How are we going to do this? We're going to proceed in 2 steps. So first, we're going to build a new data set of single-family homes at the level of each individual house, each individual unit. And for each house, we're going to build a daily panel. How are we going to do this? We're going to gather data from Zillow listings in Atlanta on a daily basis for about 1.5 years. Right? And one interesting thing about this data set, how do we do the pointer here? Oh, there you go. One interesting thing about this data set is that not only you can see the property characteristics, who's advertising the property, but for houses that are listed for rent, you can see how many people have contacted the house every day. And then for houses that are listed for sale, you can see how many people have viewed the listing every day. This is going to be very helpful for identification and estimation of housing demand. And in addition to these daily scrapes that we do, For active listings, we do something else, which is that for every single parcel in Atlanta, that's millions of parcels, we're going to observe, that is, we're going to collect what we call histories that go back to 2010 of prices, prices, rents, time on market, and we're going to impute tenancies. So how they're going to do that, here's an example of a price history for a house. This house was listed for rent in June 2021, and then stayed on market for 19 days, and then it was removed. Then it was listed for rent again about 12 months later in July 2022, stayed in the market for 10 days, and it was removed. So not only we can see price changes and time on market, but we can also impute that this house probably was occupied during 12 months and 21 days, and that's how we're going to impute tenancies here. Okay, so that's the first contribution here is price data and characteristics of houses that are listed and those that are not listed. But then we need to know also who owns these houses, right? It's not enough to know at what price they're being advertised. So to do that, our second contribution is going to be that we're going to build portfolios for institutional landlords using traditional CarLogic data on housing purchases and deeds. And this is difficult because unlike houses that are owned by private individuals, for which you know who the owner is, for institutional landlords, you actually don't see in tax records, that is in CarLogic, you don't see their name as being the owner. You actually see the name of these shell companies, these limited liability companies. Let me illustrate. Oh, before I tell you this is something that the FTC itself, so to connect to the FTC, as we mentioned yesterday, the FTC itself has worried about this. And in January 2025, it was seeking public comment on the structure of this market. This is a market that's not very transparent. So we do this, what the FTC wanted to do, but we did this for Atlanta. Right? We mapped this institutional ownership for the Atlanta metropolitan area. And in 20 seconds, what is the problem? So the problem is that, as I mentioned, John Doe and Mary Major are going to be listed as owners of houses in this fictitious market. But Invitation Homes and American Homes for Rent are not going to appear in the tax data. Instead, when we're going to look at the ownership data, we're going to see that it's some weird limited liability companies that we can't readily connect to these institutional landlords. So what we're going to do is that we're going to build these bridges between these shell limited liability companies and their parent institutional owner. That took us several months, and we have some validation that I'm happy to talk about that makes us very confident in what we're doing here. Right, so now we can figure out which house is owned by which landlord. That buys us a lot, right? So that tells us, for instance, here's two institutional landlords, American Homes for Rent in yellow and Main Street Renewal in red. You can see every individual house that they own, what is the location of the house throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area, right? And we can also see, can also go back in time, and we can also see the evolution of concentration in this market. So for instance, here we can see on the panel on the left that the top 10 owners share by year was about 2 or 3% before 2012 when institutional owners started buying houses. And then after institutional lenders started buying houses, you can see in the right panel here, this top 10 share just spiked and is now above 25%. And even 25% is kind of an understatement of how concentrated some of these markets can be at the local level. When you look at the Zillow data, at the level of zip codes, you can see that in some zip codes, for houses that are listed for rent, 2 or 3 institutions can own up to 50, 60, 70, 80% of houses that are listed are owned by 2 or 3 firms. Okay. Now let's jump straight into the empirical model. I'm going to give you a brief overview of the model, and then I'm going to just give you some details about some specific parts of the model. Right, so we're going to model the single-family housing market. There's going to be 2 sectors, a homeownership sector and a rental sector. And then we're going to have 2 types of players, landlords and house sellers on the supply side, prospective renters and prospective home buyers on the demand side. We're going to embed the rental structure, the rental sector with an ownership structure, where you're going to have institutional landlords and small lenders. And institutional lenders are going to be allowed to jointly price multiple houses. Small lenders, in the rare cases in which they own multiple houses, we're still going to assume that they're single product pricing. Okay, and the model is going to have three components. First, on the demand side, renters and home buyers are going to choose between vacant housing listings. They're going to make an optimal, discrete choice based on the housing characteristics and price. The second component of the model is going to be a matching technology, and that's going to translate this demand, that is how many contacts each house receives, how many views each house receives, into how long it takes for the house to sell or rent. Right? And how long it takes for the house to sell or rent is going to feed into the supply side, where sellers and lenders are going to maximize profits. And they're going to compete and set prices. And what they're going to trade off is occupancy and price. Right? They're going to trade off the price, right, that they advertise, and how long it takes for the house to sell or rent. So if you increase your rent, your advertised rent, that's great. You're going to get more revenue from renting. However, it takes you longer to find someone to sell or rent the house. Okay, so this is the essence of the model. In counterfactuals, what we're going to do is that we're going to shift houses between sectors. And then we're going to change the ownership structure and the cost structure of the rental sector. And we're going to resimulate equilibrium again in both sectors. Okay, so now in a very limited time that I have, let me just give you some details of some parts of the model. I'm going to focus on the rental sector. The homeownership sector is somewhat similar, especially on the demand and the matching part. Okay, so with demand, there's going to be two things in the model. There's going to be contacts and there's going to be actual rentals. We observe both of them in the data, so we're going to have them separate in the model as well. Consumers are choosing which house to contact, right? And later on in the next slide, I'm going to show you a technology that's going to translate contacts into actual rentals. And the market's going to be a zip code we couple, and individuals are going to get utility from renting a house, right? So they care about the price at which they rent. There's a demand shock psi JT here that encapsulates all the housing characteristics, and then each individual is going to receive a type 1 extreme value shock that we're going to model as an asset loaded with one S for the outside option, one S for the inside goods, and substitution between the two is going to be governed by this parameter sigma here. Okay, so this is going to give us market shares, not for each firm. It's going to give us market shares for each individual house. Okay? And then, to translate that into occupancy, we need a matching technology. So this matching technology is going to bridge these contact rates and successful rentals. And it's going to do that by translating contact rates into how long it takes for a landlord to rent a house. All right, so how do we do that? We implement that in a very simple way. Time on market tau is given by this functional form. Here is just the mean daily contact rate exponentiated to some parameter epsilon tau here. And if you take logs, you can see that the interpretation of this parameter is just the elasticity of time on market with respect to the mean daily contact rate. Right, and what's the variation that we're going to use to estimate this parameter? Well, as you can see from this graph here, you can see that houses that have more contacts, they're going to rent faster, right? So if you have an average of 10 contacts a day, you're going to rent in about 15 days. If you have 2 contacts a day, it takes you about 40 days to rent. And that's a very tight relationship. And that's why we care about contacts. Same thing for views in the homeownership sector. So these are highly, highly predictive of how long it takes for a house to rent or sell. Okay, and then finally on the supply side, what we're going to have is landlords are going to set prices to maximize profits, and they're going to make the trade-off between price and time on market that I mentioned before. And before I show you the full profit function, let me just introduce this notion of occupancy. That's just very simple. Occupancy is just tenancy duration over tenancy plus time on market. Right, and here, tenancy duration in the current version of the model is exogenous, but it's very flexible across neighborhoods and house types. And time on market here is going to depend on the previous parts of the model that I've shown you before. And then finally, the profit function for landlords is going to look as follows. So if you're a landlord L, for each house J that you have in your portfolio, calligraphic L, your profits are going to have 2 components. For the time that the house is occupied, you're going to get your price, your rent, minus the marginal cost of occupancy. And for the share of time that the house is vacant, you're going to get 0 minus the marginal cost of vacancy, right? We can rearrange this into something that looks very familiar to a Microeconomics, price minus marginal cost times something between 0 and 1, right? And just two things that I wanted to say. This marginal cost here is a net marginal cost. And it's the difference between the marginal cost of occupancy and the marginal cost of vacancy. We're going to estimate a very negative marginal cost, which suggests that the marginal cost of vacancy is very high. And then we can just, take first order conditions and back out these marginal costs as done traditionally. So now let me just, in the last minute and a half that I have, let me just show you our counterfactual results. So we're going to have three counterfactuals. Status quo, our main counterfactual is going to be 2009 ownership. That's a world in which institutional investors never entered, right? So you look at houses that are owned by institutional lenders, you look at where they were in 2009, before institutional investors even entered this market, and then you just shift them back to the sector they were in 2009, okay? This is going to imply massive shifts of houses from the rental sector to the homeownership sector, because when we look at the data, we see that about 3/4 of houses owned by investors were previously in the homeownership sector. Okay, and this is going to quantify the overall effect of institutional purchases. Now, we're not only interested in the overall welfare effects, we're also interested in the two forces that I mentioned before, right? So to do that, we're going to simulate today's world minus concentration, right? We're just going to take today's world and remove concentration. This is what we call the concentration of the rental sector. That's going to isolate the effect of concentration from institutional lenders versus the effect of rental supply. Right, so in practice, what we're going to do is that we're just going to keep rental supply intact, and we're going to assume that all lenders, institutional lenders, are pricing as single product pricers, okay? And we're going to change their cost to the cost of small lenders. Okay, this is what we call counterfactual all sold to small lenders, because it's as if all houses owned by institutional lenders were sold to small lenders. Okay, so let me just show you the results. So here's the main the status quo. You can see rental sales stock, average prices in each sector, and average quantities, equilibrium quantities. So the first thing that you notice when you look at column 2, which is a world in which institutional investors never entered, is that today's rental stock is much higher. And that's precisely because of what I mentioned before, that is, a lot of the houses that are purchased by institutional lenders were previously in the homeownership sector. And the overall effect in terms of prices is that today's prices are 2.5% lower, right? And this implies that renters, not only because of prices, but also because of quantities, etc. But this implies a gain for renters of about $2,800 per year. Now, when we look at the counterfactual of today's world without concentration, we can see that the reason why we're having this reduction in price is because the concentration effect is actually substantial. It's not negligible. However, the supply of the rental supply effect more than offsets the effect of concentration. And that's how we get an overall decrease in prices and an overall increase in welfare. It's really because the rental supply effect is much larger than the concentration effect. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so let me just conclude. In this paper, we build an equilibrium model of a single-family housing market. We do that by building a new data set of single-family houses in metropolitan Atlanta. We estimate housing demand, matching, and seller costs, and then we use our model to counterfactually assess welfare effects of institutional landlords. And really, the main finding of this paper is that renters benefit from these purchases, and we decompose these gains into concentration and rental supply effects, and the rental supply effect dominates the concentration effect. Okay, thank you very much.
How y'all doing? Let's see. There must be a clicker. This is the clicker. Is it going forwards or backwards, do you think?
It's going forwards.
Maybe that's a good thing.
Yes.
How many appendix slides do you have?
A bunch.
Not enough for a job market paper. You need more. Yeah, it's too few. All right. Wow. All right, here. How many do you think you have? There we go. Here we go. Okay. Good morning. How y'all doing? Nathan Miller. I've got a disclosure available online until my website crashed. It's not actually available online anymore, but maybe I'll fix it. But it does say within the previous 5 years, a real estate brokerage company has been among my clients. Okay, so that's true. Thank you for the presentation. I've seen this paper now 3 times. I like it very much. And I also think you present it really clearly. So what's the fact? The fact is near Atlanta, after the Great Recession, private equity firms bought up a bunch of single-family homes and converted them to rental houses. All right, so this has been in the popular press. Why? Well, the biggest narrative, like if you think about what everyone's thinking, well, number one is we've got market power in the rental sector, so maybe rents are too high. But they're buying it from single-family homes, so the prices of a single-family home also goes up. And so you're sort of hosed on both dimensions if you're looking to buy or to rent. And if you can't afford to buy a house in particular, that's like the loss of American dream. And so that's a real big thing, okay? At least in this country. So what are we going to do? Well, not what somebody normally would do because we're empirical IO economists. So what we're going to do is download a giant data set. We're going to plug it into a really complicated structural model, and then we're going to press go, and we're going to get an answer. Okay, so some comments. One is that the data set is incredibly detailed. I miss the days in structural IO when you could sort of download the serials data and write something. This takes real work and effort, and it's one of those papers that you learn a lot in section 2. And I think section 2 is a significant contribution to the paper itself. It's documenting changes in the ownership of houses across space, mainly in the suburbs of Atlanta, and I just felt like I learned a lot, okay? The sophisticated structural model, what makes this hard is that it's essentially a matching model. It's trying to line up how many folks are leaving the rental market and then sort of looking for rental properties, okay? And in these matching markets, you're going to have to compute sort of a steady state equilibrium. That's what Felipe does. It's very nice, but it's going to come with trade-offs because to make something complicated like that work, you're going to have simplifications on other dimensions, okay? And I'll come to some of those, but I want you to keep in mind, in particular, that we're dealing essentially with nested logit within zip code areas, which are pretty small. Now, the nested logit structure is going to have inside goods, in one nest, outside good, and the other nest. I really like the treatment of market size and the outside good, but we're going to have like logit style substitutions among apartments within a zip code and no substitution between zip codes. All right, so I'll come back to that. All right, so what do we have? So we have this sophisticated structural model. Now I also wanted to present a different sophisticated model. Okay, I'll do this in a sec. Okay, big picture question. Okay, here's another thing I like about the paper is that it's sort of like you can read it and then you can say, wait, this is kind of really fun to think about. So here's a question, like who should own single family homes? Like should you own them? Or should a private equity company own all of them, or most of them? And you can think about, well, maybe as an economist, we would think about what's more efficient, okay? And so have in your mind here that maybe owning a bunch of houses is efficient because you can save on maintenance costs, because you can just hire a plumber, and your plumber goes around to different houses. And as long as those houses are close together, there's sort of savings associated with that. There's some model of economies of scale here that's localized economies of scale associated with owning multiple houses. On the other hand, if you own the house, but you don't live in it, you create a principal agent problem. Okay, maybe it makes more sense for individuals to own homes because then they take care of them and invest in the house and do good things. And again, I have the connection to the American dream. All right, so okay, second big picture thing is the location of market power the same as the location of economies of scale? All right, now I didn't know exactly how to phrase this, okay, but what I have in mind is some of the research we've seen about concentration in the retail sector. If you look nationally, it's going up. If you look locally, it may even be going down. What's going on with that is that scale economies in retail involve like big improvements in IT, logistics, development. So we get big national chains. They're doing more and more of the sales, or at least have been over the last couple decades is my understanding. But then if you look at local markets where the competition plays out, there could even be sort of more stores or more of these firms competing against each other. And so you have a situation where competition plays out locally, but the scale plays out nationally or regionally, okay? And I'll come back to that in a moment. It has to do with the zip codes, okay? Here, if scale can be achieved at the neighborhood level, right, but renters choose between neighborhoods, there might not be sort of this trade-off between, we might want scale, but we don't want the market power, and maybe they go hand in hand, or maybe they don't, okay? So I want to be thinking about that. All right, so here's my sophisticated model, okay? I'm going to start with supply and demand. These markets will be balanced. In some sense, you can see prices are at the same level. They don't have to be in the same level, but they have to, just think of it sort of as sort of in some notion of equilibrium between the two. What will happen is we're going to shift units to the rental market like this. Okay, so units leave the market for homeowners, they move for the market for renters. We can see right away that house prices are going to go up for buying homes and down for renting homes. Okay, good. Next observation is that there's got to be some sort of efficiencies here. Why? Because essentially you're going to be buying house prices as that price moves up, and you're going to be then renting it at some sort of rental rate that reflects the value of the home that's now lower. All right, so why would you do that? You would do that if there's some sort of new technology that allows for efficiencies. I don't know exactly what that is. It's something like having the plumber, the one thing I just described. And this is one thing I would like to see more in the paper, is sort of more of a discussion of like what these efficiencies are. And it'd be nice if it can come through the data, but we're going to do the BLP sort of like infer data from a first order condition, or infer cost from a first order condition. So our ability to really get at this is going to be a little more limited than I might like, okay? But I think their efficiencies have to be a key part of the story. And then, of course, it would look very different if individuals shift between markets, right? If folks then see this discrepancy in prices and they start renting, you're going to just get very different effects. The prices are going to reequilibrate, and it's more of a quantity story. All right, so here's the suggestions for the paper. One is if you can understand the basic conclusions of this phenomenon with supply and demand, right, the contribution of the paper is really about measurement. All right, and I think measurement here is important. We're measuring sort of the contribution of market power and how that plays into the supply side, okay? But I wonder if you can do a little bit more. Like, you've got this big model, okay? So the question is, can you do sort of a set of interesting counterfactuals that'll help us understand this or that? And I don't know what this or that is, but it's something for you to think about, okay? You might be able to do more. So you already have a 50-page paper with a lot of slides. So more's, you take the caveat, or that's what it is. Okay, second, these are the things that I think I really am a little concerned about. The question is the measurement good? All right, that's the question to wrestle with. Okay, so one is that the model takes as exogenous the transfer of individuals from home and ownership to rental and vice versa. Okay, and that's just the way it is. I don't know. Maybe I assume you do that because it would be hard to do anything else. So the question is then, could you do a check where you sort of arbitrarily increase the quality of rentals is better, the quality of single-family homes is worse? Like, there's got to be some sort of compensating rental adjustment you could look at that would let us understand the consequences of this. Then the third thing has to do with the treatment of geography. Looking at competition in local zip codes to me seems pretty arbitrary. Okay, what I mean by that is that's one way you could group units. You can also do something like group units according to how expensive they are, or how far apart they are, or how far from the district. You could sort of code this sort of thing up and use a clustering procedure to come up with different market areas. If you did all of the suburbs, the competition would be much greater because the concentration is so localized. That's just what will come through with your nested load demand model. Now, to be clear, what I'm proposing is a simple version of running like a complicated BLP model, because I think you need that nested load structure. Rather, what I think you should do is change the boundaries of what's the inside product. For example, you could do 2 zip codes, you could do 3 zip codes, you could do, zip codes that have similar properties. You could leave the zip codes entirely and do this at the house level and pick combinations of houses that do some sort of clustering thing, and just run the model. And just, the point is not that one of these is right and one is wrong. It's just, I want some notion of for how sensitive the answers are. And I think this is one of those papers that if the answer is that if it ends up being sensitive, that doesn't really diminish the contribution. I think a lot of the contributions in section 2, and you're showing how this might play out under different assumptions of how the market works. So that's the main thing. Lastly, ambitious paper, love the data collection. I like having an I/O paper in this space. The question is, do we have to rent our homes in the future? And it's a future question, so I do what you do, and I ask Claude, and so what Claude says is actually kind of nuanced. Apparently, private equity owners, like the institutional thing is still going on, but it's a little less of these giant private equity owners in Atlanta. It's more like actually mom and pops owning multiple units. Well, I don't know, and we'll see how it plays out. Okay, thank you, great paper. Thanks for letting me discuss it.
We have time for one question. Anybody?
Not the most interesting economics question, but this struck me like the game Monopoly. I know it's Atlanta and not Atlantic City, but the way you set it up is explicitly, oh, when you have 3 properties, you get to raise the price because you build houses and hotels. So I'm just wondering, like, as you try to communicate this to more and more people, I suggest making that connection explicit, because it would make it a lot more accessible.
I thought of having the monopoly as my first slide, but my advisors convinced me to do otherwise. Yeah, let me just address one thing. So that's something that thank you, Nate, for the discussion. I think that I just wanted to address one point, which is that, oh my gosh, I have to go back to the slides. We do a little check on a little robustness check on substitution between renting and owning, and so what we do is that we, oh gosh, if I had a keyboard. I passed it, right? Sorry. So one thing that we do to check for this margin is that we look at the substitution between the inside and the outside options in each sector, and we just assume, there you go, we just assume, say that, all the renters priced out of single-family rentals become a buyer, and we assume that all the homeowners that are moving from the inside to the outside option were previously renters. So that's kind of a stress test, which is something that it looks like you wanted to do. And what we find is that even in this extreme case scenario, our results are not very much changed. I mean, the effect is actually changed by quite a lot if you just look at the total effect on rental prices. But the overall results are not changed by that much. So that's something that we investigate. For zip codes, these are giant zip codes. So if you look at just how they compare to, say, Philadelphia, this is a typical suburban zip code in Atlanta. Same scale. This is Philadelphia. And but I completely agree with your point that we need to check at different market definitions. Yeah, but happy to talk about it more. Thank you.
Always blame your advisor. Okay. Next up, we have Yihao Yuan from the University of California, Los Angeles, and his paper will be discussed by Mark Reisman of Boston University.
Okay. Thank you for having me. I'm Yihao Yuan from UCLA, and today I'm presenting my paper titled Exclusive Contracts in the Video Streaming Market. So in the video streaming market, streaming services like Netflix and Hulu often license content from external studios like Universal and Paramount. And among these licensed titles, 87% are available on only one streaming service. Such exclusive distribution is often enabled by prevalent exclusive contracts where a studio commits to distribute a title to only one service. For example, Netflix had an exclusive contract with Warner Brothers for Friends and Hulu with FX Networks for Fargo. And the prevalence of exclusive contracts in this market is driven by two main forces, both of which can lead to controversial effects. First, streaming services want to use exclusive contracts to license unique content, so they can differentiate from their competitors, attract new subscribers. However, this leads to us consumers complaints about the rising streaming cost, partly because we need so many subscriptions to access all the exclusive content we want. In addition, studios also want to restrict the contracts to be exclusive, sometimes, so they can play streaming services off against each other to negotiate more favorable deals. And here is an example. Netflix and Amazon had a bidding war for a recent movie called Crime 101. And during negotiations, what the studio did was to bring Netflix's bid to Amazon and ask if Amazon was willing to pay more. And in the end, Amazon outbid Netflix with $100 million. As a result of similar practices, hefty licensing deals are very common in this market. Studios may gain from these hefty deals, but small streaming platforms typically cannot afford such hefty exclusive deals. Only those streaming giants like Netflix and Amazon Prime can do that. The ambiguity in how these two forces net out, as well as the surrounding controversies, suggests the importance for us to understand who gains and who loses from exclusive contracts. And in this paper, I answer this question by developing a structural model that captures both forces. The model incorporates consumer demand for titles and subscriptions, platform price setting, and contract negotiations between studios and platforms. And I estimate this model using new unique data sets on title viewership, household subscriptions, and title distribution. And using the model and estimates, I quantify the impact of exclusive contracts by simulating a counterfactual without them. And I find that the controversies we just discussed cannot be fully reconciled. In particular, exclusive contracts actually benefit small streaming services without much in-house content and small studios with weak bargaining power, while the larger studios and larger streaming services mostly lose. And consumers also lose due to both reduced title distribution and higher subscription prices. Now, let me introduce a stylized model of contract negotiations to highlight the key forces behind exclusive contracts. Let's consider a very simple setup with one studio, Paramount, licensing one title, Criminal Minds, to a distribution network, which can be Netflix only, Hulu only, or both. And Paramount makes its choice to maximize the license fees it can collect from both services, which in turn are negotiated with these services based upon the additional sales profits they can generate from licensing this title. And I assume these sales profits to follow the numbers underneath the streaming service logos. And here they are just hypothetical examples, but after this example, I will have a full model to quantify these numbers. I adopt the Nash with rate of replacement bargaining solution to determine these fees. When Paramount decides to license to both Netflix and Hulu, it can acquire a share of their sales profits proportional to its bargaining power B. And it's assumed to be 0.5 in this example, which means Paramount can acquire half of the sales profits from both services, which generate a total profit of 8. Notice here, these fees are the same as the standard Nash solution. Alternatively, Paramount can commit to exclusive distribution, possibly through an exclusive contract. In this case, Paramount can still go directly to its licensee and split the profit in half following Nash. Or it can use Hulu as a threat to negotiate a potentially better deal with Netflix. And in practice, studios can exert such threat by going back and forth between streaming services and ask which one is willing to pay more. For example, Paramount can go to Netflix first, split the profit in half, and get 6. Paramount can then bring this offer to Hulu and squeeze Hulu to pay over 6. And the Hulu's new offer, in turn, can be used as a threat to squeeze Netflix to pay even more. And Paramount can go back and forth between Netflix and Hulu like this until Netflix makes an offer of 7, which Hulu cannot outbid. In short, this model captures the ability for Paramount to commit to exclusive distribution and create the scarcity in licensing right. It can then induce the streaming services to compete for this scarce licensing right and negotiate a potentially better deal with Netflix. Notice here, an exclusive contract with Hulu is not an option because Hulu is only willing to pay up to 7, but Netflix is always willing to pay more. And in this case, Paramount will choose to distribute to both Netflix and Hulu to maximize its profit. Now, let's see 2 other examples where exclusive distribution will arise. Suppose now, going exclusive generates much higher sales profits in the previous example. It can happen, for example, when everyone in the market already has subscription to either Netflix or Hulu. In this case, if Criminal Minds is added to both services, nobody will add any new subscription to her basket because she can already access the show through her existing subscription. So it will be more profitable for Paramount to distribute to only Netflix. So it can help Netflix differentiate and create a larger pie to be divided. And Paramount can achieve so by inducing current Hulu subscribers to either switch over or to multi-home on both services. And importantly, the profitability of this differentiation approach depends on how willing consumers are to multi-home, especially for those loyal Hulu subscribers who would keep their Hulu subscriptions regardless. The more willing they are to multi-home, the more profitable it will be for Paramount to use exclusive distribution to help Netflix differentiate and induce consumer multi-homing. And bargaining is another important force behind the rise of exclusive contracts. Let's reinstall the profitability of exclusive distribution to be the same as in the first example. But instead of Paramount, it's A24 licensing this title. It's a much smaller studio, so I assume its bargaining power to be much weaker, only 0.25. In this case, exclusive distribution will still arise, even though distributing to both Netflix and Hulu generates a larger pie to be divided. This is because with its weak bargaining power, A24 can only get a small slice of this large pie. Instead, it will be more profitable for A24 to commit to exclusive distribution, so it can induce Netflix and Hulu to compete for this exclusive right and get a better deal from Netflix alone. However, without exclusive contracts, in this case, A24 will always want to further approach Hulu after reaching an agreement with only Netflix. And once Netflix and Hulu expect that, they have no reason to compete for exclusive right or pay anything higher than the Nash fee in the first place. Therefore, the only stable outcome in this case will be the non-exclusive distribution with Nash fees, unless exclusive contracts are allowed. Altogether, this stylized model shows that studios often want to use exclusive contracts to negotiate more favorable licensing deals, either by creating a larger pie to be divided, by differentiating these streaming services, as in the second example, or by using such contracts as a bargain leverage to acquire a larger slice from a potentially smaller pie, as in the last example. Also, the last example suggests that studios with weaker bargaining power are more inclined to use exclusive contracts to improve their bargaining leverage. And my data shows support for this inverse relationship. I find that the big 5 studios, which produce about half of the content in this market and are generally perceived to have stronger bargaining power, are about 4 percentage points less likely to use exclusive distribution. And considering that only 13% of the titles are distributed to multiple platforms, it suggests that there may be some substantial differences in the contracting strategies among different studios. And now let me give you a quick overview of my full model, which has 3 stages. In the first stage, streaming services negotiate licensing contracts with studios and set subscription prices at the same time. And in the second and third stages, consumers make subscription and viewership choices respectively. On the demand side, I use a random coefficients logit model for viewership. So individuals with different taste for content choose which titles to watch. And before the viewership, each household decides which set of streaming platforms to subscribe to, considering both the subscription cost as well as the content preferences across all household members. Here, to capture consumer multi-homing, each option within this discrete choice model is a unique combination of streaming platforms rather than a single platform. On the supply side, streaming platforms set uniform prices across different geographic markets and time to maximize their payoffs with expectation to consumer demand. And combining the profit margins recovered from this pricing model with the demand estimates, I can then quantify the bilateral gain between streaming services and studios from licensing the title J to a service K. And in the contracting stage, studios and streaming services negotiate contract to split these gains. And this is where the stylized model kicks in. The studios can either acquire a share of this bilateral gain proportional to its bargaining power B, or it can use some excluded service as a threat to push the included service to match the maximum possible offer from this competitor. And under this rule of gain division, a distribution network is an equilibrium outcome if it satisfies two conditions. First, it's stable as no streaming service would like to unilaterally terminate a contract. And second, it's optimal for the studio among all the stable distribution networks. And I estimate this model by combining three different data sets. The first two describe the distribution of titles among the top 4 streaming services, as well as the weekly time spent by the US population on each title, split by demographics like age, gender, and race. The last data set tracks household subscriptions at DMA and monthly levels. And importantly, this data set reports market shares at bundle level. So I observe like market shares of households in DC who have subscriptions to Netflix and Prime Video, but not Hulu or Disney Plus. And this subscription data provides the key cross-DMA variation that help with the identification of some key demand parameters. Importantly, it pins down the mean price coefficient and the coefficient on content utility, which governs how subscription demand responds to prices and content. As this scatter plot shows, places with higher subscription taxes exhibit lower subscription demand, likely because these households need to bear more cost for the same subscriptions. And also, places with larger household sizes tend to exhibit stronger demand, likely because they can share their subscription account among more people and deriving more value from the same subscriptions. And on the supply side, the main challenge is to identify the bargaining parameter. Most papers in the literature require some observed data on such license fees, but I don't observe them. And moreover, in this market, all these license fees are paid as lump sums, meaning that I cannot recover these fees using the first order conditions of optimal pricing either. And to overcome this challenge, I use the inverse relationship I just discussed, that studios with weaker bargaining power are more inclined to use exclusive distribution. Therefore, I compare the networks that would maximize the bilateral gains for a studio to the one that it actually chooses in the data. A larger gap or a narrower observed network implies a weaker bargaining power for the studio. And I find that these streaming platforms have an own price elasticities varying from about -1 to -1.7. Most streaming platforms are substitutes to each other, with the only exception being Disney Plus and Hulu, mainly because consumers can get free access to ESPN Plus when subscribing to both of them together. I also find that smaller studios exhibit much weaker bargaining power compared to the big five, suggesting that they may have stronger incentives for exclusive distributions. And taking this model and estimates, I then quantify a counterfactual without such exclusive contracts. And by comparing these counterfactual results with the status quo, I can quantify the impact of such contracts. And I find that on the streaming service side, small streaming services such as Hulu gain substantially from exclusive contracts. And this is because such services don't have much in-house content, and therefore they rely on licensing exclusive content from external studios for differentiation. In contrast, streaming giants like Netflix and Prime Video see minimal or negative impact. This is because they already have substantial in-house content, so they don't need exclusive content from external studios for differentiation. And instead, now they face increased competition from these smaller streaming services, which use this exclusive content from external studios to attract subscribers away from them. On the studio side, I find that the big five studios lose from exclusive contracts while the smaller studios gain. And both groups of studios here face a negative equilibrium effect. And it works as follows. When exclusive contracts are allowed, all these streaming platforms end up with a lot of exclusive content, meaning that they have a lot of loyal subscribers. Therefore, they fear less about losing subscribers after dropping a title. And this reduction in fear brings down their willingness to pay for content. However, the smaller studios can still come out ahead because now with exclusive contracts, they can more effectively commit to exclusive distribution and exert threat of replacement. In addition, now with the increased profitability, these smaller streaming services like Hulu become a credible threat for these smaller studios to use in their negotiations with streaming giants like Netflix and Amazon Prime. Both these forces allow small studios to improve their bargaining leverage and negotiate higher fees. However, the big five studios don't gain from such channels because they already have substantial bargaining power, so they acquire most of the bilateral gains with or without exclusive contracts. So they are dominated by that negative equilibrium effect and see an overall loss. I also find that on average, consumers lose about $24 a year because of both reduced title distribution and higher subscription prices. However, the positive impact of exclusive contracts on smaller studios suggests that in the long term, exclusive contracts may still benefit consumers by stimulating content productions. While I don't have a model to formalize such content investment decisions by studios, I do run additional counterfactuals to explore the possibility for the small studios to add more content in their productions. And I find that consumers won't gain from such impact unless small studios triple their current content production. This is because the small streaming platforms will license this newly produced content to further differentiate themselves and charge higher prices, which offset consumers' gain from additional content. To conclude, in this paper, I study the impact of exclusive contracts in the video streaming market. I find that exclusive contracts benefit small streaming services and small studios, while the larger ones mostly lose. And consumers also lose, and this loss is likely to persist even if small studios significantly increase its content production. Thank you.
Do you want your name? Thanks. All right, thanks so much for including me on this conference and giving me this great paper to read. Actually, after I read it in October for the originally scheduled conference, I included it in my PhD class. I taught it to my class, so I hope that's a sign of how much I really like the paper. Part of the reason, of course, is because when you teach bargaining in PhD classes, you end up teaching about cable television, and you have to explain to my PhD students what is cable television. And it's great to have one on a much more relevant topic. So the question we're going to have here: what are the implications of exclusive deals for streaming? I'll just say in my undergraduate course, I focus on three implications, three issues around exclusive dealing. And actually, I just ran into one of my old undergraduate students who now is an economist at the FTC, so this feels particularly relevant. Maybe I'll call her up here and test her on these three things, but I talk about eliminating double marginalization, reducing uncertainty, or encouraging relationship-specific investment, or raising rival cost and creating entry barriers. None of those are here. So this is really something different from my point of view about kind of what are the implications of exclusive dealing. Here, it's going to be all about creating demand and differentiation downstream that then the upstream firm can kind of extract through bargaining. I'm going to focus on maybe three elements in the model. So he's utilizing this Nash and Nash equilibrium with the threat of replacement, which I understand is being used in some antitrust advocacy and even litigation settings. So I thought it was useful to kind of highlight some of the modeling issues that come up as we do this. So stage one, the studios are going to pick whether they want to do exclusive dealing or not, and bargain, and at the same time, services set subscription fees. Stage two, this is exactly what you already presented, so I'm just repeating. Consumers subscribe to a bundle of services, and then in stage three, consumers watch. So one issue I just want to highlight in these bargaining models is this stage one, where in some papers, that setting of subscription fees happens in a later stage. Okay, so yeah, just as Yehow said, the exclusive deals, the point of the exclusive deals is create market power for services which studios can capture, and basically enhance extraction by studios. But I guess the modeling issue I want to focus on is whether that service, that kind of setting of subscription fees happens in stage one or stage two. It differs across different papers. I think Crawford and Urkoglu has the setting prices in a later stage than the negotiation of the fees, where Crawford, Urkoglu, Winston, and Lee has it in the same stage. So what the implications of that are is that when you're setting the exclusive deal, when you're deciding whether to exclusive deal, you're taking prices as constant. The studio is taking, that's kind of a feature of this Nash equilibrium, and that means that the studio is not going to account for how maybe choices over exclusive dealing or not affect prices. It accounts for how it affects quantities. That's how it enables the studio to kind of get more profits or bargain for more, but not an effect on prices. Maybe that's okay here because the effect, the prices are so sort of fixed for these services, or the effect of any one studio on price might not be that high. But I think in more general settings, this is just something to be cognizant of, that different papers are making different choices about, that I think, at least I find myself kind of reading through very quickly. But it actually has a lot of implications for how you think about the implications of those first stage choices. So the studios are going to anticipate their effect on service quantities, but not on prices, because they're taking that as fixed because it's being made in the same period. Let's talk about stage three for a moment. So the consumers are making this discrete choice over what to watch. I think it's a really cool model of television watching that's quite different actually than previous papers of television. So each kind of half hour, they make this discrete choice over all the shows that they have kind of accumulated through their bundle. They make their choice over shows, not streaming services. So basically you take all the shows that you get from your streaming services and put them in a pile, and then you get to pick which one you want and watch every half hour. So there's really zero benefit in this model by assumption of being able to watch a show on multiple services. So that creates this, that creates some of the kind of dynamics in the paper about how consumers are making choices. A couple things that are left out: you can't rent on Amazon Prime or something like that. There's no kind of on-demand renting, which I actually don't know how big of an issue it is. I think one thing that really might be important is there's really no using up of your catalog. Every period you make the choice between the same set of shows, so you don't get that feature of people kind of binging, and then they're done with this channel and they turn it off and they come back 6 months later and subscribe for 1 month and watch everything. That can't happen. So nobody ever kind of goes down in value because they've watched everything. It's a really hard thing to model, but I will say there's a paper out there. It's by myself, so I can't resist citing myself here, but I'll just say we have a paper on people watching movies, where we're trying to get that decrease in demand over time through this kind of consumption durability. But I think it would be pretty hard to include it here, but I do want to highlight, I do think that this issue could be important. I mean, at least when I read the kind of media analysts talking about this current merger thing with Paramount and Warner Brothers, you do hear about trying to get the back catalog and keeping people engaged in their channel, Netflix or whatever, for a long period of time. Seems to be like a really big issue in this industry, and so I wonder if there's anything we could do to talk about it in your setting. And then the last thing I'll just point out, the way to think about exclusive dealing here is that you get, you can imagine that the studio goes out and does Nash bargaining with all of the potential services, and then separately holds a first price auction over kind of full information over who's willing to pay the most, so they get the second highest willingness to pay out of that, and then they get the max of all of that. Whatever is the maximum of that is what they get. I'll just say that one thing I'm struck in this paper, and of course, there's not much data on the outcome of these things, like you don't get to see the fees, so I think it's actually maybe appropriate in this context, but in general with these national natural replacement, there's no parameters in the kind of auction branch of things. That is, once you've estimated, if you could imagine getting rid of the Nash bargaining and just having them hold the auction and going with and getting the second highest valuation as your model of exclusive dealing. That's a reasonable model of exclusive dealing as well. In that setting, there's literally no parameters governing the bargaining stage of the model, which I think is a little unsatisfying for us as economists. You could imagine that maybe that's something that could be enriched with a more flexible model of auction or something like that. The bargaining parameters there and telling you, something, and that's kind of the parameter that he's focused on. So, I think it's kind of reasonable in this context, but in general, I wonder if that's something we want to kind of enrich, and maybe and this isn't a methods paper, so I don't want to ask you to kind of build all new things, but just kind of going forward, I feel like that's an issue for how we think about these kind of threat of replacement, and I think of that threat of replacement literature is really emanating from a lot of the work that the FTC has done in healthcare settings. So I'm almost out of time, so so at this point, like, is this too mechanical? Is there a way to parameterize the payoff from the replacement threat? I'm just about out of time, so I'll just, kind of quickly finish up here. Exclusive dealing benefits to small firms because it distinguishes itself, because, it's this kind of like, this was shown in a couple of papers, without exclusive dealing, just everyone would buy Netflix, and so it gives the small firm a chance to be different. Exclusive dealing, I think, a really cool feature of this paper. It's kind of a prisoner's dilemma for the large studios. They would like, every studio would like to be the only firm doing exclusive dealing, but it benefits each firm individually, and they all end up kind of signing exclusive deals, but actually the big firms in this model gain when you get rid of exclusive dealing. Consumers lose from exclusive dealing. Keep in mind, that had to happen in this paper. There's no benefit, because all of the mechanics of the paper are bad for consumers in exclusive dealing. And then he's got this great counterfactual about how much kind of, if more products came out, how much would consumers benefit? So yeah, I have this point about the great paper. I actually find the results really believable, although I raised all these questions about modeling, and I'm over time, so I have one last question I'll leave here for the group to think about, and I will stop here. Thank you very much.
All right, we have time for one question.
Hi, so this is a great paper. My question is that there's a lot of both vertical integration in this industry and also studios entering the streaming industry and streamers entering studio production. So first, how do you deal with vertical integration in the model? But then second, can you say anything about the incentives there using your model?
Yes, so I abstracted away from this presentation, but it's part of the paper. So with vertical integration, studios do have a strong incentives to license content to their vertically integrated parts. Like Disney licensed substantially more content to Disney Plus and Hulu compared to any other studios. And of course, this so in this particular setting, this vertical integration actually helps Hulu and also helps with Hulu's competition with Netflix, which I think is pro-competitive here. I also want to quickly address the thank you, Mark, for all the wonderful discussion. I think the last question is really interesting about why exclusive deals doesn't exist in the music streaming market, but exist a lot in the video streaming market. Actually, I think the reason is there is an important reason here, because video streaming platforms like Netflix and Hulu are basically, I would say, the last stage of the content. It's the very end of a product life cycle. So at that stage, what the studios are trying to do is to max out the benefit of this content. However, for video streaming, it's different. Video streaming happens at the very beginning of a product life cycle. So what those music labels want to do is to promote their content. And the most profitable part of the music industry is actually those live events like concerts or maybe vinyls as well. So the incentives of music labels versus movie studios are very different. That's why exclusive deals don't happen that much in music streaming. Music labels want to promote their content by just distribute to more platforms as much as possible, while such incentives don't exist in the movie industry. Hope that helps.
Okay, we're going to conclude with Naheem bin Zahur presenting online from Queen's University, and his paper will be discussed by Jihye Jun of Boston University, also coming to us online.
All right, thank you very much for including my paper in the program. This paper is about long-term contracts in the liquefied natural gas industry. Next slide, please. And the next slide. So the motivation for this paper is that we see a range of capital-intensive markets with the following features. So first, firms have to make large sunk cost investments before trade can take place. Second, these firms that are making the investments can often trade only with a small number of potential partners. And finally, what we often see in these markets is this phenomenon where firms are going to sign long-term contracts before they invest. So these are what I'm going to call ex-ante contracts, and that's going to be the focus of this paper. And so there are many examples of such industries. When you can think of the market for automobile parts that sparked a bunch of the early literature on incomplete contracting. There's the market for coal. Today's focus is going to be on the liquefied natural gas or LNG industry. And that's essentially a global industry for trading natural gas by liquefying it so that you can transport it using ships. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a key trade-off that arises when it comes to the use of long-term contracts. On the one hand, by signing these ex-ante long-term contracts, firms can potentially mitigate this problem of underinvestment. And so this can arise from a couple of channels. First of all, by using ex-ante contracts, the firm is able to provide a guaranteed revenue stream, right? Because they already have contracts lined up. There's less uncertainty about their future revenue, and that makes it easier for the firms to obtain financing from banks or other lending agencies, and potentially means that they can obtain cheaper financing, which is going to help with the investment. Second, there's a bargaining effect at play as well, where if the firm were to proceed with the investment without any contracts, without any ex-ante contracts, then they're potentially in a hold-up situation where their trading partner can appropriate part of the surplus, which can then lead them to underinvest. And so signing ex-ante contracts is essentially a way to get around this underinvestment problem arising from this bargaining effect. At the same time, there's a key drawback of long-term contracts, which is that they can be potentially less flexible compared to trading on the spot, and that can limit the ability of firms to respond flexibly to demand shocks. And so in the LNG application, this trade-off is going to be present because a key part of the infrastructure is that sellers have to make investments in export terminals or liquefaction terminals, And these are very costly investments that typically cost in the tens of billions of dollars. And so what we see in this industry is that sellers are typically going to sign ex-ante long-term contracts for a large share of their capacity before they actually commit to these investments. At the same time, LNG has been subject to large demand fluctuations. You can think of the Fukushima nuclear disaster in Japan. You can think also to more recent years where there was the COVID shock, and then there was the, after the onset of the Russia-Ukraine war, there was a huge spike in European demand for LNG. Now, contracts can be somewhat rigid in responding to such demand shocks because LNG contracts often have certain rigidity. So there are take-or-pay restrictions, and there's widespread use of resale restrictions, which essentially prevent buyers from reselling the LNG to other buyers. Next slide, please. And so this leads to the research objectives of this paper, which is that what I'm first going to do is to try to quantitatively evaluate this trade-off between investment and allocative efficiency. I'm going to try to understand how does the use of these long-term contracts that are potentially rigid affect investment and affect allocations. And that then leads to my second question, which is going to be a policy counterfactual, where I'm going to evaluate regulations that try to prohibit resale restrictions in long-term contracts. So that's been a regulation that's been proposed and to some extent implemented by antitrust authorities in both the European Union and Japan. And so the key trade-off here again is that these regulations can increase flexibility, but they can potentially reduce investment. And so we kind of need a structural model to evaluate the long-term welfare gains of these regulations. Next slide, please. And so the way I'm going to answer these questions is to develop a new multi-stage model of investment contracting and spot trade that's applied to the LNG industry. A key feature of this model is going to be that the incentive for sellers to invest is going to depend on when contracting takes place, and the sellers and buyers are going to choose optimally whether to do contracting ex ante or whether to do contracting ex post, taking into account that this is going to affect the seller's decision to invest. Contracting rigidities are going to be present in this model, and that's going to potentially inhibit flexibility. At the same time, there's also going to be this interaction between contracts and spot market power, which is essentially that because sellers have market power on the spot, that's going to mean that contracts might have a pro-competitive effect. So we actually need to tease apart this rigidity effect from these pro-competitive effect of contracts to understand if contracts hurt or benefit allocative efficiency. And so I'm going to estimate this model using a data set of LNG contracts, investments, and trade flows that I've collected. And a quick preview of findings is that we do find this trade-off is important. So if sellers couldn't choose long-term contracts, they would reduce investment by about 30%. But the contracts, I find that the contracts do lead to substantial allocative inefficiency. And so when I do look at the policy of banning resale restrictions, I similarly find that that's going to lead to reduced investment. However, that's going to be outweighed by the gains in allocative efficiency, which is going to result in a net increase in welfare by about 20%. Next slide, please. Okay, in the interest of time, let me actually skip the literature review. So if you could go to the next slide and the following one. All right, so let me start off with an overview of the LNG industry. So the key players here are going to be on the seller side. These are going to be national and international oil and gas companies that develop these LNG export projects. And the typical buyers of LNG are going to be utilities that basically use LNG, use natural gas for heating or for power generation. And so as I mentioned before, trade is going to require that sellers invest in these export or liquefaction terminals. And these are the costliest part of the investment in the supply chain. And they typically take a long time to build as well. So the typical time to build is around 5 years. Now, trade in this industry is going to be carried out using both long-term contracts and spot trade. The shares of the two are 75% for contracts, 25% for spot trade. Typically, these long-term contracts have a duration of about 20 years, although there's quite a lot of variation in duration. The contract is going to include an annual quantity that the seller provides to the buyer, as well as a pricing formula. One key feature of the contract is that there are going to be provisions that potentially limit flexibility. And so in particular, during my sample period, which kind of ends in 2017, most long-term contracts include destination clauses. And so these are clauses that essentially prohibit the buyer from reselling the LNG that they contract to a third country. Okay, so next slide, please. So I'm going to use the data set that I have constructed that consists of data on both long-term contracts and investments, as well as data on the spot market. And so for each long-term contract, what I see is the signature date. I see the beginning and the end year, and I see the contract, and I see the annual quantity, the quantity every year. One thing that I don't see are contract prices, which are confidential. And so that's something that I'm going to address in the estimation. I'm going to have to have a way to estimate the bargaining power without actually seeing the contract price. I also see data on these investments, and essentially what I will see is how much they invest when they commit to the investment, which is going to be the date when they reach a final investment decision. And that's going to be different from when the plant actually starts up because of time to build. I'm going to complement this data on contracts and investment with data on trade flows for each country pair. And these trade flows are going to be broken down into both trade flows under contracts and trade flows on the spot market. And together with that, I also have data on spot prices and shipping costs. So we have a pretty rich understanding of, rich view of what's happening under both contracts as well as the spot market. Next slide. Okay, so let me start off with a few descriptive facts. So the first thing that I want to show you here is that there's widespread use of these ex-ante long-term contracts, and they actually account for a lot of investment. And so focusing on the second picture here, what that shows is the share of capacity that's contracted at various points in time for the average investment. And that vertical red line in the middle, that's the date when the seller reaches a final investment decision. So contracts to the left of that those are the ex-ante contracts that the seller signs before they commit to the investment, and then the contracts to the right are the ex-post contracts. And so what you can see is that what the sellers typically do is that they're going to accumulate these ex-ante contracts until until a large share, about 60% on average of the capacity, is already contracted, and that's when they will make the final investment decision. So they'll typically not make a final investment decision until they have contracted a large share of the capacity. There's only 23% of the capacity that's contracted under ex-post contracts. Next slide, please. What I also show in the paper is that this use of ex-ante contracts is related to the relative bargaining leverage of sellers compared to buyers. And so the way I do that is that I measure the geographical isolation of each seller and buyer. And the idea here is that if a seller is located close to the buyer that they're negotiating with, but far away from alternative buyers, then the seller is in a relatively weak bargaining position relative to that buyer, right? Because if the buyer pulls out of negotiations, the seller now has to incur higher shipping costs to sell to someone else. What I find is that, consistent with the model that I'm going to develop later on, there's more use of ex-ante contracting when sellers are more geographically isolated or when buyers are less geographically isolated, right? Suggesting that it's the bargaining leverage of sellers relative to buyers that's prompting the use of ex-ante contracts. The idea here is that when the seller is in a weaker bargaining position, they don't want to rely on the ex-post contracts because the buyer can capture a big share of the surplus. And so that creates this incentive to use ex-ante contracts. I also find evidence consistent with this financing channel. Essentially, what I find is that in plants that have a greater share of ex-ante contracting tend to have a lower cost of investment per unit. Next slide. What final piece of evidence, which is trying to show that contracting rigidities actually bind? What I do here in this regression is that I regress the share of each seller's output that they sell to each buyer, and I look at how that allocation of output across buyers in the cross section depends on the net price that the seller gets from the buyer. So the net price here is defined as the destination spot price minus the shipping cost that the seller has to incur. And so the idea here is that if a seller were allocating LNG efficiently and responding to demand shocks, then they would be highly responsive to these price differentials. And that's indeed what I find for sellers that don't have much of their capacity contracted. I find that they tend to allocate most of the LNG to buyers that have, where they get a higher net price. But as the share of capacity that's contracted increases, I find that this responsiveness decreases. And in the limit, the sellers that have all of the capacity contracted tend to not respond at all to short-term price differentials. And so this is consistent with contracting rigidities actually binding in this market. Next slide, please. And the following one. Okay, so let me now tell you about the structure model. And so this picture essentially summarizes how the model works. So stage one is going to be when sellers and buyers negotiate ex-ante contracts. And so they're going to do Nash bargaining over the contract quantity, as well as the lump sum transfer that the buyer pays to the seller. And so these ex-ante contracts are signed at a point where the seller has not yet committed to the investment. And so what's key here is that the outside option of the seller is going to include the possibility that they don't invest at all, or the possibility that they invest less than they would, in case bargaining breaks down. In stage two, the seller is now going to make their investment decision, taking into account the ex-ante contracts that were already signed. And then in stage three, there's going to be another round of contracting where the sellers and buyers negotiate ex-post contracts. And again, they do Nash bargaining over the quantity and transfer. The key difference with these ex-post contracts is that by now, the seller's investment has already been sunk. And so at this point, the seller cannot back out of the investment. And so this is where the buyer has a relatively stronger bargaining leverage because they know that the seller is stuck with this investment. Once the contracting and investment is completed, then every year the sellers and buyers are going to arrive on the spot market. The buyer's demand shocks are going to be realized. And any capacity that's not committed under long-term contracts is going to be traded on the spot market. One key assumption I make is that the sellers are going to compete, score no competitors on the spot market. I have some other work that suggests that this is actually true in practice. Next slide, please. Okay, just to provide you a little bit more detail on about the demand side and the cost side. So buyers are going to have a fairly standard downward sloping demand function here. What's key here is that this demand is going to be volatile and uncertain. So every period they're going to be subject to demand shocks. And these demand shocks cannot necessarily be foreseen perfectly in advance, right? And so at the point of contracting, the sellers and buyers, they know the expected demand for the buyer. They don't know the idiosyncratic demand shocks that the buyer might get in the future. Sellers are going to incur both the production cost and the shipping cost. And as I mentioned before, there's going to be no competition on the spot market, which actually is going to result in price discrimination in the spot market. Next slide. Okay, so let me provide you a little bit more detail on how I model investment and contracting. So the investment cost function is essentially going to be a quadratic function of the capacity that the sellers built. However, what I'm going to allow for is the possibility that ex-ante contracting affects the cost of investment. And so the idea here is that if the seller has already committed a bunch of its capacity to ex-ante contracts, then when they go to the bank to obtain financing, then they can potentially obtain cheaper lending rates because they can, they have guaranteed revenue for that part of the capacity. And so the way I capture this is to allow for the cost of investment to be different depending on how much of the seller's capacity is committed under ex-ante contracts versus not committed at all. If the seller has uncommitted capacity, that's potentially going to mean that the seller incurs a higher investment cost. As I mentioned before, I'm going to use Nash bargaining to model the negotiations over both ex-ante and ex-post contracts. And so essentially the way that's going to work is that the contract quantity will be chosen to maximize the bilateral surplus, and then the lump sum transfer will be chosen to split surplus in relation to the bargaining rates. And so the bargaining leverage, as I alluded to before, is really going to depend on when the contracting happens. And so in the ex-post contracting, the seller is going to have relatively weak bargaining leverage because the investment is already sunk, whereas they're going to have a stronger bargaining leverage in the ex-ante contract. Next slide. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'll probably skip over estimation. So if you could go to the counterfactual slide, next two slides, the following one. Okay, so let me, in the counterfactuals, what I'm going to do is two things essentially. So first, I'll quantify this trade-off that I began with, this key trade-off in using long-term contracts, where contract rigidities could hurt allocations, but long-term contracts can potentially mitigate underinvestment. So I'm going to look at how using contracts affects allocative efficiency and how that affects investment. That's going to then play into this final counterfactual, which is the main policy counterfactual of interest, where I'm going to evaluate these regulations that prohibit the use of resale restrictions. Next slide. Okay, so the first thing that I do is I'm going to hold investment fixed because I want to focus on the allocative efficiency effects. And then I'm going to look at how the market would allocate LNG if there were no long-term contracts used, and so all of LNG was traded on the spot market. Now, this is actually not going to straightforwardly lead to increased welfare because there's actually two competing effects. So on the one hand, because everything is traded on the spot, the market is very flexible in responding to demand shocks. But at the same time, because there's market power on the spot market, removing contracts actually worsens this market power effect. This is this Alazin-Villa effect that was documented theoretically in 1993, and then there have been a lot of work showing that this effect is actually important in many energy markets. And so what I find is that this latter effect is present, but overall this flexibility effect dominates. So you actually get a 2.5% increase in short-term industry surplus when you move from long-term contracting to spot trade, again, holding investment fixed. What I also find is that this is really tied down, this is really linked to the ability of firms to respond to demand shocks. And so if we look at the last column, last row in this table, what you see is that if we didn't have any demand uncertainty, then actually moving from long-term contracts to spot trade would reduce short-term surplus, and that's because of this market power effect. Next slide. What I do next is I'm going to look at how how the ability to sign long-term contracts affects investments on average. And so the first counterfactual that I do here is I'm going to look at how much a seller would invest if they could not sign any long-term contracts at all, neither the ex-ante nor the ex-post. What I find there, and that's the second row of this table, is that investment is going to decrease by 31% on average. And I do another counterfactual to try to understand where this comes from. And what I find is that this is mainly due to the ability not to sign ex-ante contracts. So in this other counterfactual, that's the one in the last row, what I do is I allow for the sellers to still do ex-post contracting, so they can still invest, and once they've invested, they can sign contracts with buyers, but they cannot do ex-ante contracting before investment. And what I find is that we get almost the same reduction in investment. Next slide. So the final counterfactual is the policy counterfactual that I mentioned, is going to be to look at the effects of removing these destination clauses or resale restrictions. This is actually something that's been attempted by both the European Commission and Japan's FTC. But these efforts haven't fully succeeded in removing destination clauses in LNG contracts. Even today, much of LNG trade is carried out with these destination clauses. And part of the reason is that the exporters have really pushed back against these policies, right? The exporters of LNG tend to argue that they need these clauses in order for investment to take place. And so there are two different effects at play here. One is that when you prohibit resale restrictions, then buyers can now engage in resale, and that can be a way to increase efficiency in responding to demand shocks. Essentially, when one buyer experiences a positive demand shock, other buyers could resell their contracted LNG to that buyer. On the other hand, these policies might reduce the seller's incentive to invest because they essentially reduce the ability of sellers to price discriminate, and we're dealing with an industry where there might be underinvestment. And so the counterfactual essentially evaluates what would happen in the long term if we were to remove resale restrictions. Next slide. So what I find is that there is indeed a sizable reduction in investment by about 30% on average. Despite this, we see large welfare gains of about 21% coming about from the fact that although there is less LNG produced, it's allocated much more efficiently. Now, these welfare gains are not evenly distributed between buyers and sellers. What we see is that buyers gain substantially. Their surplus goes up by 26%, but sellers actually made worse off. And this speaks to this tension that there is in this industry where much of the pushback against these resale restrictions have been coming from regulators in LNG importing countries such as the European Union or Japan, where many exporting countries have not been willing to give up on these resale restrictions. And this partly reflects the fact that they might be actually made worse off by the removal. Next slide, please. Okay, so I think I'm probably out of time here, so let me conclude here. This paper is about looking at the long-term effects of these long-term contracts and investment and allocations. Let me wrap up here, and I'm really looking forward to Jihei's discussion and your comments. Thank you very much.
Hello. Well, thank you so much for inviting me to discuss this paper. Apologies for joining virtually, but I'm really excited to discuss this paper. If you haven't figured out by now, it's a really impressive paper with sophisticated modeling, impressive piecing together of data, and a really strong estimation strategy. And so let me jump to the brief summary and then some of my comments. So next slide. So this paper tackles a fundamental question. Do long-term contracts enhance or hinder efficiency in capital-intensive markets? The setting is a global LNG industry where investments are enormous. It takes $10 to $20 billion on average to build a single terminal, and long-term contracts dominate trade. What's really interesting here is that at the same time, there's a growing and active spot market coexisting alongside these contracts. And also there's significant demand uncertainty and regional price dispersion. And crucially for the holdup story, buyers have bargaining power. So there's only a limited pool of buyers at any point in time. And there's high shipping costs, which make it expensive for sellers to switch between buyers. Next slide. And so to highlight the strengths of the framework that Naheem uses, here contracts affect both investment incentives as well as residual spot supply. And so without contracts, sellers anticipate that they have weak bargaining power ex post, which may lead to underinvestment. At the same time, as I said, there is spatial variation in demand, which means that there is reallocative gains from spot trade. And because contracts commit quantities to specific buyers or regions, when demand shocks occur, gas cannot be reallocated efficiently and spot market becomes thinner. Next, please. And so the key externalities here is that parties, when they sign the contract, do not internalize that a contract would reduce residual supply available to others, and that it might also raise spot prices for remaining buyers, which then may lead to excessive contracting in equilibrium. Next. And so this is important for competition policy because there's this attention for regulators. Long-term contracts may encourage investment, may solve a hold-up problem, but it could also reduce flexibility and distort allocation. And the core contribution of this paper is to provide a quantitative framework that can evaluate this trade-off. Next, please. One of the nice contributions of this paper is to identify this bargaining parameter for the seller, tau, without being able to observe the contract prices. And this is the case in many other settings. So this is a methodology that can be applied elsewhere as well. And so the key idea is the following. The sellers that are far from alternative buyers are in the position of weaker outside options. They get to capture less from exposed bargaining. So to compensate this, parties may sign larger contracts. And so Naheem uses this variation outside option across geography and time to identify this parameter. Next, please. And so this is really nice. I think the paper could even emphasize this more, particular generalizability. And one suggestion is to make this identification mechanism even more clear in the paper. So by connecting the reduced form evidence that he presented to this parameter. And so you could imagine using the estimates to generate the predictions of these ex-ante contract share and plot that against sellers' isolation measures, the relative distance to alternative buyers, and confirm that this model predicted relationship holds up in the data. You could even go one step further and to see how the model changes as tau varies. Next, yeah, here. Oh, yeah. So one other suggestion I have is that, okay, the paper shows that equilibrium contracting reduces wear flow relative to having no contract, but no contracting is also not necessarily optimal. So we could quantify this using by solving a planner's problem, and I would really love to see this because I think it'll allow the paper to make a sharper welfare statement. It would allow the author to separate the efficiency losses from over-contracting from the gains that come from the commitment itself, the contracts themselves. Next. One other question that I had is that in the data, the spot market is really expanding markedly in this time period. So I think through the lens of the model, this means that there will be higher value of reallocated flexibility and perhaps lower needs for ex-ante contracting. And so the question is, do long-term contracts become more distortionary over time? And so the paper could perhaps kind of clarify how this trend affects interpretation of results, but also engage with the data and see how contract share changes as the spot market is growing. Next, please. In the interest of time, I'll move on to the next slide. Next slide, please. And just talk briefly about potential future directions from here. Given that this is a very polished paper and for future research, I think it would be really interesting to talk about the interaction with the market structure. And so in the data, the US exports are growing from near zero to the US being one of the major exporters. And so it'd be interesting to think about how do long-term contracts affect entry incentives. And does the flexibility reform, so the removal of the destination clauses that the paper talks about, affect market structure over time? And the next thing is that, as with climate policy, so as the world is transitioning more to renewables, I think this would mean that there will be increased demand volatility and even more dispersion across regions. And I think this framework can be used to think about how that that kind of impacts the value of flexibility and then the distortions that contracts can cause. So that's it for my my discussion. Thank you very much again.
Okay, I think unfortunately we don't have time for questions, but we'll be back after a 30-minute break at 11:25 for Avi's keynote. Thanks.
Hello, welcome back. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Avi Goldfarb. In honor of Avi's keynote address titled Consumer Protection and Antitrust for General Purpose Technology, I decided to ask AI to write me an introduction for Avi. This is what AI had to say. Avi Goldfarb is a distinguished scholar and thought leader in the field of economics, widely recognized for research at the intersection of technology, data, and market dynamics. Based at the University of Toronto, Avi Goldfarb has contributed extensively to understanding how digital transformation shapes economic outcomes and policy. In addition to academic work, Avi Goldfarb plays an active role in policy discussions and conferences, including organizing sessions for the FTC Microeconomics Conference. Was a little too on point, I think. Recent collaborations highlight expertise in topics such as algorithmic pricing, consumer protection, and the economics of information. Through seminars and workshops, Avi Goldfarb engages with practitioners and policymakers to bridge theory and real-world applications, fostering dialogue on critical issues in modern markets. I thought that was pretty good. Well, with no further ado.
Okay, thanks everyone. As I was preparing this talk, I realized my first draft was like an hour and a half. And so we're going to focus on the consumer protection part more than the antitrust part. Disclosures, full one is on my website, but I work with Keystone Strategy a fair bit. And most recently I testified in support of Epic Games against Apple and Google in Australian antitrust case. Okay, so my talk is going to have 3 key points and then a call for action. So point number 1 is artificial intelligence is likely to be the next general purpose technology. Point number 2 is to describe what a general purpose technology is. They're technologies that generate an innovation feedback loop between producing and applications industries. So it's not just that they're important technologies, it's that innovation in one upstream leads to innovation in downstream and back. And third, early regulatory and enforcement decisions for general purpose technologies end up having an outsized impact on the rate and direction of innovation. And I walk through 2 stories from what happened with the regulation of the internet in terms of verification and privacy. That said, I think we have almost no rigorous economics research on how to think about the policy and enforcement, the implications of policy and enforcement on innovation, maybe even generally, but especially with respect to general purpose technologies where you have this feedback loop between producing and using in application industries. Okay, so first point, AI is likely to be the next general purpose technology. So a little less than 10 years ago, we hosted a conference in Toronto, an NBR conference, thinking about AI. What are the implications of AI going to be on the economy writ large? And the core theme of that conference was people over and over again said, if AI proves to be the next GPT, then we should be at this conference. And if AI is not the next GPT, then what are we all doing here? We're probably wasting our time. And so the first 6 or more papers at that conference were versions of how do we think about this technology if it proves to be a general purpose technology. Since then, a handful of papers have tried to explore this question about whether AI is a general purpose technology. And I think by 2026, the consensus is, if anything, then yes. It's very likely to be the next general purpose technology. There's a paper in Science called GPTs are GPTs by Dan Rock and co-authors. There's some work by the OECD and elsewhere, and then Florence Theodoritis and Bloody Task and I tried to put some direct measurement against what Bresnan and Trachtenberg called a GPT and look in the job hiring data to see if AI looked like a general purpose technology. Now, I've been talking about AI. We have some questions about what AI is. For the purposes of this talk, in some sense, you can use the definition you want. When I'm talking about AI here, it is very much that you are, that it is a tool that we use to help us fill in missing information. Whether you think that means that we have truly intelligent machines or not, I'm indifferent to, but recognize that it is a tool that will allow us to fill in missing information in new ways. Azaleh, Kruger, and Nagaraj have this recent paper that talked about the market for AI and AI in terms of antitrust concerns. And there's lots of interesting stuff in that paper, but the thing I'm going to highlight is just this simple pyramid, okay? And the reason I'm highlighting this pyramid is that there's 4 parts to it. So there's an application layer, there's a model layer, there's a data layer, and there's a compute layer. And in their paper, they're focused on what it means to have market power in each of those 4 layers. Today, what I'm focused on is to point out that what happens in one layer affects the others. Innovation and data collection impacts what kind of foundation models you can build. The kinds of foundation models you can build impact the broad types of applications that you can create. The types of applications then in turn can go back to compute in terms of whether you need small chips all around the world or more intense data centers focused in a small number of places. So we have this feedback loop between application, foundation, data, and compute, and that's in essence why you can think about this as a general purpose technology. The idea that the most innovative industries tend to not be one technology, but are really many technologies that together feed off each other goes back a long way in economic history. Nate Rosenberg talked about technological change in the machine tool industry, and one of the core takeaways of that paper is there is no one innovation in the machine tool industry. It's not like there was a technology called machine tools that then led to transformation of the American economy in the late 19th century. Instead, there were innovations that were happening in all sorts of companies, manufacturing mostly around the country. And then eventually those innovations got to a point where it made sense for somebody to set up a company that made machine tools. And then once that happened, that led to downstream innovation in the factories that were using those machine tools. Now, Rosenberg 1963 did not call this a general purpose technology, but it is foreshadowing in many ways what we see in the data. In the data on general purpose technologies, on AI in particular, what we see, at least in the hiring data, is that if somebody is hiring for AI, they're also hiring, this should be clear, the data period is 2010 to 2019, so some of the words look like anachronisms, but if someone is hiring for AI, they're also hiring for business intelligence and big data and data mining and data science and natural language processing, and perhaps even expertise in cloud computing. Okay. So a job posting that has one is disproportionately likely to have all the other ones. It's not even that if you're hiring for one, you're likely to have a different job posting for the other ones. It's that in many ways, this suite of data-related technologies are the same technology. Okay, so if we accept that AI is likely the next general purpose technology, then I think we need to spend a little bit of time talking about what a general purpose technology is. So Bresnan and Trachtenberg in their 95 paper talked about the steam engine, electrification, and semiconductors as technologies that had a long-run impact on productivity and society at large. Okay. And the reason for this impact is because what they tried to do is embed an economics of innovation model into an endogenous growth model in macro. And that makes the paper as hard to read as you imagine. Okay. It is a brutal paper to read. It's a couple of IO economists writing an endogenous growth paper using some IO. But the ideas in there, I think, are really powerful. And the essence of it is they talk about semiconductors as a GPT. Then they talk about hearing aids and radio and computers and CT scanners and cars as downstream innovations to semiconductors. And then when you have those downstream innovations, it leads to other innovation upstream. And then once they realize they can do things with semiconductors, that leads to innovation downstream and back and forth. And that's how we end up not in the long run of the solo growth model where we have no growth. So remember, in the long run of the solo growth model, we have no growth. The endogenous growth folks focused on human capital, kind of at the same time, because this paper took a little while to get published. And Bresnan and Trachtenberg emphasized an innovation route, which is that one innovation didn't just increase total factor productivity once. What it did was lead to follow-on innovations. Innovation itself was endogenous based on prior innovations. So they define it as widespread potential for innovation, and also this innovation happens not just in the producing industry, but also in the application industries. And depending on which paper of Bresnahan's you read, you can call it co-invention, or you can call it innovational complementarities, or something else. Use sort of 3 or 4 different versions of the same word, but always it's about this innovation feedback loop between producing and using industries. So that's what's common about general purpose technologies. Each general purpose technology is also a little bit different. Otherwise, who cares that we have AI and not semiconductors, or semiconductors, not the internal combustion engine? And so Ajay Joshua and I wrote this chapter on how do we think about those differences. So you can think about the steam engine as reducing the cost of power. That was the benefit, even though you still need co-invention, and that's what makes it have an outsized impact. And with the internet, arguably the last general purpose technology, all of the action was in information. So the internet made the processing and communication of information much cheaper. And so the policy implications of the internet and the interesting policy around the internet was all about information. We're going to talk about verification and privacy, but there's also things like search. When you're regulating GPTs, the stakes are higher. Not just because it's widespread across the economy, but in particular because the things you do now are going to affect the downstream innovation firms and downstream innovation, which will in turn affect what happens upstream. And so we can look to what happened in the 1990s with the regulatory decisions taken by the FTC and others to map out how those decisions affected the rate and direction of innovation in a particular way. So, my next point, the early regulatory and enforcement decisions for GPTs have an outsized impact on the rate and direction. So I'll give you a sense of this. In the late 90s and early 2000s, it kind of felt in many ways like the AI literature today. There were lots and lots of people writing about its potential, leveraging what we understood from basic economics, and we hadn't quite invented a new economics of digitization yet. But in the first Journal of Economic Perspectives symposium on e-commerce, we already saw a few themes come out. It was already obvious that search was going to be cheap, and that was going to have implications for pricing and price dispersion. It was already obvious that the transportation of information was going to be cheap, and that would have consequences for competition between online and offline retail. And it was already obvious that copying information was going to be cheap, and that was going to create consequences, particularly for copyright law. About 20 years later, Catherine Tucker and I wrote a digital economics review article for the JEL, and we highlighted 5 changes. 3 of them were already obvious by 1998. But 2 of them were not. And in the early internet literature, it was not clear that it was going to be easy to track people. And it was not clear at all that online it would be easier rather than harder to verify information. I'm going to argue that those 2 last changes were in many ways a consequence of regulatory decisions, not just about the nature of the technology itself. So, early on, yes, the internet made it feasible for millions and millions of users to connect with each other, but it wasn't designed for large-scale commerce. There was no trust or verification system built into TCP/IP, and in the NSFNet, if you were trying to do commerce or posted an ad, you would get scolded and maybe even get kicked off the network. And so as it scaled and privatized, one of the core ideas about the internet, what people loved about it, was its anonymity. And this New Yorker cartoon was everywhere in those days. This idea that on the internet, no one really knows who you are. And you think you're interacting with one person and it could be somebody totally different. In Shane's book, he emphasized that they just weren't thinking about security in the early days. They were trying to figure out a system for approved researchers to communicate with each other efficiently. And then they had to have some innovations, 95 to 2000, in terms of security on browsers and software and credit card policy. But fundamentally, the network itself wasn't focused on verification and security. Then eBay comes along, and that's a problem. Because eBay wants buyers and sellers to transact, and there's no inherent way to tell if the buyer is who they say they are and the seller is who they say they are. And that created some problems. And so one of the solutions that eBay put forward was what we now think of as obvious, but then it was super innovative, of a rating system. And so they added this rating system and online reviews so that so if a seller didn't deliver what they said or a buyer was a total jerk, that everybody else could learn about it. It was a bunch of work by economists to document the role of this, and they emphasized that these rating systems had a meaningful impact on trust. And so as the rating systems got better, people started using these systems more. Then Chris Delaroca speculated that, well, wait, if these rating systems are so good online, maybe we're going to start using them offline. This was in 2003. By 2010, that happened. Brett Hollenbeck and Mike Luker showed in the context of Yelp and TripAdvisor that these online rating systems, originally designed to help online people communicate with each other, turned out to be such good verification systems that they substituted in many ways for offline brands. For example, in Brett's paper, he shows that branded hotels became less important as TripAdvisor diffused around the country. Because if you're driving from one side of the country to the other, and you want to stop at a hotel, before you might have stopped at Motel 6 or Holiday Inn because you don't know anything else, but now you can check the TripAdvisor reviews and see if this small mom and pop hotel is worth it. And you can kind of think of Airbnb as another level and another layer on top of that. And Mike showed similar things in the context of Yelp. So there's the online verification systems turned out to be so good that they ended up impacting what happened offline too. This did not happen in a vacuum. The FTC and other parts of the US government had a deliberate policy in thinking about protecting consumers online. One important part of that was enforcement against fraud. First case was in 94. By 99, you had brought, I guess, 100 cases to stop internet scams. That enforcement to say that online commerce is part of the mandate and we're going to focus on fraud must have mattered to making people trust what happened online. So a version of Joel has this paper on sticks and carrots in the context of eBay. And so the stars you can think of as the carrots. eBay had some limited sticks that if people behaved very badly, they could kick them off. But the ultimate stick here in this context is law enforcement, and that did matter. And so we needed better verification to have some e-commerce. That led to innovation in verification, which also required some enforcement of fraud, which led to more e-commerce, and we ended up with this virtuous circle. And so the e-commerce system that developed And the rise of platforms online where you could buy and sell were in many ways a function of the regulatory environment. And there were other regulatory choices that could have led to a different offline and online verification environment. Eventually, when people were posting reviews of their own stuff, that became a target. But let me be clear, in '96, people were posting reviews of their own stuff too, and that wasn't the focus yet. And that may have made a difference in terms of that likely made a difference in how these things evolved. Similarly, we have Section 230C that says the platform itself was not liable for what was in the reviews. That regulatory decision, again, made it easier for these platforms to evolve to facilitate trade. To facilitate trade where they don't actually take possession of the item like a traditional retailer. Something similar happened in online privacy. Okay, so the point up until now is Catherine and I, in our article, highlighted online cheap verification as a fundamental aspect of the way we think about the impact of the internet today. And that may not have happened. Might have been a different regime that was also good and valuable, but who knows? But the path that we saw was a direct result, I would argue, of the regulatory decisions of the 1990s. Something similar happened in online privacy. The online privacy choices in the 1990s made by the FTC and other branches of the US government emphasized notice and awareness, choice and consent outside of children. Children, we had COPPA, we had different regulatory policy for children, but for everybody else, as I understand it, it was you have to say what you're going to do with data, and as long as you follow what you say, you're fine. That led to an increased use of data in business. Different regulators took different paths. Garrett Johnson has this fantastic summary of the impact of GDPR across all sorts of industries, summarizing dozens of papers, if not more. And maybe the Jiajin and Wagman paper summarizes the essence of it as well as any, which is the GDPR made technology venture investment in Europe, particularly. So I'm thinking about artificial intelligence as a distinct general purpose technology from the internet, which in turn is distinct from semiconductors and computing. One could argue that it's all the same technology. And if it's all the same technology, we can think about this environment of data that was the policy environment that enabled the use of data with particular consent was valuable not just in facilitating targeted advertising on the internet and aspects of the advertising supported software industry, but it is also an essential input into the rise of machine learning and artificial intelligence in business. So again, those early decisions ended up having an outsized impact. These are early decisions on data that allowed us to build foundation models, that allowed us to find applications, and frankly, that made it worth it to change graphical processing units that were designed originally to help people play computer games, to understand that that matrix multiplication would be good if we had enormous amounts of data. And so we again have this feedback loop between decisions, ultimately regulatory decisions for the 1990s, to what we're seeing today. Now, I'm being unfortunately vague on impact. I can say like, hey, this mattered, but I don't really know exactly how. And I don't think we know enough to say, if we make these kinds of decisions today, how is that going to affect the rate and direction of innovation in AI going forward? And part of the reason we don't know is because the future is murky. But part of the reason we don't know is because we haven't even done this work rigorously as economists on the impact of the internet, on the impact of semiconductors, on the impact of the steam engine, et cetera. And so Like, technology policy is hard. It's hard because there's all sorts of technological and demand uncertainty. It's hard because when things are changing, there's a need for experimentation, etc. But I also want to highlight, I would argue that we do have a rich literature on those ideas. The rich literature tells us things like there's a lot we don't know, but there's a rich literature that helps us clarify the trade-offs. But with AI, we also have a different set of challenges. And with GPTs, we just have a different set of challenges because we know impact and we don't know why. I don't know if you guys have been paying attention to the labor econ literature on AI, and they walk through the tasks that are involved within a job and identify which tasks might be done by AI. And then those papers, especially the best of those papers, says these jobs are going to be impacted. Like the Alonso et al. And Dan Rock's paper, these jobs are going to be impacted. They're so careful about it. And then if you read it carefully, they're like, well, impacted could be fantastic and it could be awful. And we have no idea. I think in this context, we're in the same situation. We have a sense of where the impact will be. What we do is going to matter, but we don't know enough, really, about how. We don't know about does antitrust enforcement on compute affect innovation, the foundation model, and application layers, and how. Do restrictions on data flows affect foundation models and the types of compute? What types of restrictions and model outputs affect the feasible set of applications? All these are big open questions that I would love to see more research on. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions, or are we done? I'm not sure.
We have time for one question.
One question. Are we ready for lunch? Mark.
Oh, great, thanks. That was a great talk. And I love seeing the use of published papers as a graphic in a presentation about AI. I guess my question was, I was really interested in your thoughts about the policy decisions that we make. You know, one defense of GDPR was supposed to be that it would create a market for privacy, and you could imagine that creating more investment, not less, would be maybe the first thought that economists would have. And of course, the kind of large language models have been trained on like a freely available corpus that maybe could have ownership rights that you could imagine leading to a better economic outcome rather than a worse one. So I just wonder if you have any thoughts about this kind of ownership of information and how we should be thinking about that going forward.
So I think the details and how you like had GDPR set up a market for data, I think that would have been really interesting. And maybe a good answer is another way to think about that is the Fair Credit Reporting Act was privacy regulation. Okay. And it was incredibly effective privacy regulation because both buyers and sellers of information, or the providers of information and the people who needed it, got a benefit. The Fair Credit Reporting Act said, if you're denied credit, you can ask why. Okay. And that's great for you because you can get to know why. But it turns out it's also great for the people who are denying you credit because if they denied you credit for something that's untrue, then their credit information is also better. And so absolutely, there are ways to think about regulation about data or other kinds of information that facilitate market exchange. And I want to be careful. I don't want to say that the GDPR was unsuccessful. If the goal was to prevent data flows, then it succeeded in many ways. And that's a legitimate political goal. It's just, maybe it succeeded more than it anticipated. Maybe it succeeded less. Actually, if you talk to many people who drafted it, they think there should be even less data flows. So I see I agree with you that like the details of how you legislate really matter and how you enforce. And not everybody thinking about this really wants the market solutions, but they're out there. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So that actually concludes the conference. I just wanted to thank all of our presenters. In addition, wanted to thank the audience members. None of this happens without all of you engaging, asking questions. Also want to thank folks who tuned in, who watched and participated. So thanks so much. So just a couple housekeeping things. Please remember to bring your name tags and your lanyards back to the table where you picked them up. For visitors, with the lanyards and the plastic FTC badges, make sure they go to the security desk. I just wanted to say for all those out of town participants, safe travels. We look forward to seeing you all again at the 19th Annual FTC Micro Conference.